be supreme. Crowned in the Lord of Peace, whose hand the scepter sways. From pole to pole that wars may cease, and all declare praise. His name shall know no end, and where his spears flee, then rise on paradise and send their fragrance ever sweet. And in all of years, the potentate of time, Creator of the rolling spheres, ineffably sublime. O hail, Redeemer, hail, for thou hast died for me, and praise shall never fail throughout eternity.
Dear Father in heaven, Lord, as we go through the words and the music, I just pray for a closer relationship with you. I know, Father, where I came from, and I know where you've brought me to, but I know that I'm not there yet, and I want to make it all the way. And I know that that's the prayer of each and every one of us. So I pray, Lord, as we continue on our studies, that you would draw close to us, we would draw close to you, Father, and that we would have a better understanding of our job as we go through this study, Father, on In God We Trust, that the union of church and state, that we would better understand the correct job function, and that we would be prepared, Father, to be used by you in this great work. It is such a blessing and a privilege and an honor, Lord. We thank you for our blessings. We ask you for the presence of your Holy Spirit. I ask you, Father, to help us as we go through this study to go through points that will continue to help us to grow stronger and stronger, and then our faith, Father, would be made whole by the author and finisher of our faith, Father. There is nothing, Father, that is impossible for you. But we know, Father, with us it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. We're just so thankful for this blessing and this privilege. So we praise you, Lord, and we thank you, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Bless you.
Keep the tape, right? Yeah.
Huh? What?
I had to make sure I clicked the right one. I wouldn't have to start over. Okay. So part two, we did this part one of this 2 weeks ago. And this is, like I said, it's basically her studies that are titled in Germany, Church and State. And it's just really helping connect dots. And I'm really looking forward to, because I think it's at the end of this one, she mentions that there, because the last few classes are going to be going into the revolutions, and she talks about how much that has to do with connecting more dots, connecting also November 9 more. So I'm sorry, I just hit something that made us go fast. So I'm looking forward as we get into the revolutions. We're gonna, we all decided last week, or the week before was it, I don't remember, last week, that we're gonna do, since we only have 8 classes left, we're gonna stretch them out to just 1 per Sabbath and then work on parables in the afternoons. But when we go to rescue, I'll do 2 of them there so that we don't get too far behind on it. But I just pray, it's my prayer that we're already in understanding that we start actually seeing we actually start seeing things in advance, because that's the whole purpose of this, is so that we can start seeing things in advance and not have to look back and realize, what we could have and should have already seen. So these lines are meant to continue to strengthen our faith. They're continue to hold the ship together. They're to continue to help us to see this repetition of history, so that when God declares the end from the beginning, that means that if we know the beginning, then we should know the end, and we should be able to see what is coming. So, and I think I hit record, right? Somebody probably sees it on their screen.
Let me see. Yep,
Yes, you're recording.
Okay, I get a couple things out of my way on the screen. Okay, so the subject of 2014 continues to grow, and we only have a few classes left, but what we're discovering in this study is too important to leave it. It ties together everything we've been looking at in a much more comprehensive way. And keeping in mind, I've said it a few times, that when it comes to 2014, that I always bring up Sister Allie when she came back from ACE and said that Parminder was saying that the third angel arrived in 2014. So what we're seeing now, this fallout and stuff, all of this stuff was not just come all of a sudden. It can't have just come out all of a sudden. So when you go to the understanding 2014 was the arrival of the third angel. When that first came about, we didn't understand it because it didn't line up with the models we had been seeing and understanding. So then when you fast forward to where some of the groups around the world started, saying that, hey, Jeff and Parminder are teaching two different models. It was happening. It just, we weren't understanding it. So anyway, so are you okay? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, another change, like it was Jeff to Parminder, is Parminder to Tess, that we need to see and understand.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So let's see, it brings a clarity to subjects that we have taught, but not necessarily with the degree of strength. It begins to connect quite a number of different studies. What we're looking at now connects Acts 27 to the message of two streams of information, to the message of time. And it's all big one long stream that all these different lines being put together, and each separated from each other, they're just pieces of a puzzle. But when you bring the lines together, you're putting the puzzle together and the picture becomes more clear. And that's what God's been doing through this. So though when we, way back when we began at Acts 27, you get this, that was several weeks of study through Acts 27 and going through all the classes, but you really don't know how it all connects. You get pieces of it, but you don't understand how it all connects. You go into Pyrrhus and his two histories, you go into the counterfeit and the two histories, and you start putting all these pieces together. Then you come to November 9 in 2019, all these pieces come together. So we cannot take a surgical instrument to the message of the midnight cry. The message of two streams of information in what is happening inside the United States is as much a part of this message as is November 9. And I have to think back with what we've been seeing too. Why would she say that you can't take a surgical instrument to it? Why would she say that the two streams of information are important? Because the two streams are what was rejected. Conspiracy theories and the two streams are what was rejected. The date November 9 was accepted, but without the two streams, you really can't come to that point. So eventually all of that will be gone. So we started looking at time by going to 2014. We're saying that 2014 is midnight or midway. And why are we saying that? And we went through that in the last few classes. Why are we saying that? When we lined up with the Millerite line, so we have the Millerite line down here, we see that 2014 lines up with July 21st. We know that in the time of the Millerites, this was midway between April 19 and October 22nd. So in the Millerite history, the second angel arrives here April 19th, midway between, the Spirit of Prophecy uses the word midway, and then we also, I'm pretty sure we read the Joseph Bates quotes as well, where he talks about, he mentions July 20th, and he was off a day, but it was July 21st. So then you see that you have, it was a 6-month period of time, and you have 3 months on each side, and this was the midpoint, and midpoint became a symbol to things that were to come to understand better studies. So I noticed that this is just a little bit off. It should be perfectly lined up, and it's not. So although there's not 3 and 3 here, this is symbolic in our line, but I should have the line moved over just a little bit so it was equal. But so it becomes midway. So we start to understand that 2014 was actually midway. And we went through some of that, and we might review some of it as we go through here. So then this is the structure that we built. July 21st is midnight, and we got midnight from the parable of the virgins, if you remember from last week's study. So it's midway. The Great Controversy calls it midway. The parable of the 10 virgins calls it midnight. But whichever you're going to call it, it's when the cry goes out, right? Behold, the bridegroom cometh. The third angel arrived, and behold, the bridegroom cometh. And we got all that from the parable of the 10 virgins. What is April 19th in that parable? It's when the tarrying time starts. So you had the tarrying time here that started in here. So then we have always known 9/11 to be the tarrying time. And what is October 22nd? It's the shut door. So when we say that 2014 is midnight, we built the structure, and now we need to build our line using this structure. So understanding that this is midway, lining up with July 21st. And we went through that pretty extensively before too, that though we've always called October 22nd the Sunday law, the October 22nd is close of probation. So you can't have midnight cry Sunday law. You have midnight cry close of probation. Just a refresher on that. So we can see in our history from 9/11, we're in the symbolic tarrying time. So we're here at tarrying time. And our shut door will be November 9. But to establish 2014, we have to go to, and this was one of the students speaking, we have to go to 1863, and he said it with a question mark, just to verify. So this is backing up now, and so Sister Tess is going on. We took the parable of the 10 virgins, and we took it to the line of the priests. We saw that that 2014 becomes a symbol of midway. In our history, it's not literally midway, but it has the same symbology. 2014 becomes midnight or midway. 2014 was originally established with the 126 and the 151. And I think we went through that as well. And we do have some slides that'll kind of review it, but we do have the 151 on here, just not the 126. But these became symbols of the 2520. And we went all through that last time. They become symbols of the 2520. And that, and understanding that we're at an end of a captivity or an end of a darkness, end of a scattering, and coming into a gathering. So it was established by the 126 and the 151. We broke down the 2520 into 2 periods of 1260. We can see a 1260 takes us to 1798. We know that from the papacy line, 538 to 1798 is 1260 years, takes us to 1798, which is the time of the end, right? And then we see the 126 takes you to 1989. Well, I believe that was 1888, correct? 1888 to, did I say that? Oh, to 1989, 1863 to 1989. Is that correct? I don't want to mix them up. Somebody do the math real quick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So 1863 to 1989 is 126. So you're at the end of a scattering period and coming into a gathering now. So when we went to Daniel chapter 5, 2520 gerahs is the 126 shekels or 151, depending on the value of the currency in the particular region. These become symbols of the 2520. We can take these dates backwards from our marks, our waymarks, and connect our waymarks into Millerite history. So we take the 151 and 126 as symbols to take us back into Millerite history. We want to spend the most amount of time on 1863, which is the 151, and we have that here from 2014. 1863 to 2014 is 151 years. Then we saw 1863. This was a midpoint in a period of history. So we saw the midpoint here between the Civil War. This is the history of the American Civil War that began in 1861 and ended in 1865. This is one witness to see that this midpoint doesn't just take us to 2014, but now we're overlaying a period of history. So even though 1863 takes us to 2014, we're also getting this history of the Civil War showing us that 1863 is a midpoint between two different dates, which helps us then to lay that over this structure, to over our line, to be able to give us a structure here. So if this was midway, taking you to 2014, it's midway, then there's got to be a structure here that matches this structure here. Let's see. So what does 1861 become as a waymark in our history? So if you look at 1861, and it's on the, it's prior to 1863, we've marked 9/11 as that in this structure in our line, as that period of time that is prior to 2014 to midway. So, and then 1865 then becomes November 9. So 2001 and 2019. Midway is 2014. Now we can overlay that whole Civil War in our history. And doing that then takes us to that history to see what happened in that history. And that's where we went into and are going to continue to go through when it comes to the phrase "In God We Trust" and where that all came from. But it began with this structure here, taking this structure here from the Millerite history to develop a structure up here. Then we go back here to 1863 using the symbols of the 2520, the 151 and the 126, to take us to 1863 to give us more information. So each structure in each line gives us more information. Do you need to plug in?
No.
Okay. So we began to look at what happened in the American Civil War, and it's a battle between the North and the South. In the North is the Union, and this is largely Republican, but not entirely. And in the South is the Confederates, and it's mostly Democrat. This is a civil war between the two, the North and the South. In 1861, at the beginning of the war, a Baptist pastor in Pennsylvania sent a petition to the Treasury, and what did he want? He wanted God to be recognized on the currency. This was Pastor Mark Watkinson. We've got his picture over here. And he wrote to the Treasury, and he said, "No nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense." He says the trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins. He said that this would save us from the shame of heathenism. He says that we have a difficult time.
Hold on.
Go ahead, what?
No, it's okay. I said hold on,
Go.
but it's good.
Oh,
It's good now. There won't be an echo.
okay. Sorry. Okay, so he says that we, the North, have already claimed that we're under divine protection, but this would openly place us under God's protection. He is saying we're in a civil war, we're in a difficult time, and we need to claim God's protection by recognizing him in the strongest word on the national level. So in 1861, there's a petition to recognize God on currency. This is the excuse for divine protection, and part of it is also a political tool. They're saying there's two sides, and we're the side that's on the side of God. You know, you have the North and the South, and the Republicans, the North, they're on the side of God, and they want to make this statement. So we can trace that same response to 9/11. Billy Graham spoke a few days after 9/11. He was careful in his words, but his daughter Ann Lotz spoke, and she says that 9/11 was punishment by God because we've removed God from our marketplace, our streets, our businesses, our schools, and our politics. She's just one of quite a few voices saying that we are outside of God's protection because we've removed God from our politics, our schools, and our businesses. And I can say, for one, for a very long time, I still believe that this is what was happening as well. This punishment in the way in which they're looking at it, and that we need to bring God back in. But we've all had it wrong, that it's not bringing God back in, it's keeping the separation that people have the right to choose. So, and this is the statement by Mark, was it Mark? Yeah, Watkinson. "One fact touching our currency has hitherto been seriously overlooked. Watkinson wrote to the Treasury Secretary. This is November 13, 1861. I mean the recognition of the Almighty God in some form on our coins. No nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense. The trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins. You will cause a device to be prepared without unnecessary delay, with a motto expressing in the fewest and tersest words possible this national recognition. So in 1861, he sends a petition to Congress, to the Treasury, to recognize God on the coins. You've got here the North and the South. North represented by the Union.
That was
South,
him?
yeah,
One of the pictures did that?
yeah,
Okay.
the pastor. Baptist, didn't it say Baptist? Baptist, yeah, Baptist pastor in Pennsylvania. Roy Moore is a politician in Alabama who was in the news a great deal. If we're following American politics in the last year, he was a very controversial figure. Trump endorsed him very strongly, and he spoke about 9/11 is punishment from God. And this is Roy Moore here. The links are here if you want to read more of the information on each of these. They're within the slideshows and within the notes. So, and I do remember this one being mentioned. Well, Jerry Falwell goes way back, so we remember him, but I do remember Roy Moore couple years ago, wasn't it a couple years ago? But he spoke about 9/11 as a punishment from God. We need to get back to God. Jerry Falwell goes back many more decades, into the 70s particularly. It's been claimed that he founded the religious right in America. He's been involved in some very interesting conspiracy theories, also involving Clinton. He brought together a group of conservative pastors in the 70s and the 80s to try and see how they could save America from a moral decline. And that's the whole purpose, is to bring morality into it, and that now the church, when church and state unite, that the church can dictate morality. When you have your right to be immoral if you want to be immoral. And to take away that right is to then dictate from the church, which you will no longer have your freedom, going back into bondage, which is the ultimate bondage at the end between Christ and Satan, ultimate slavery. So while we're looking at slavery in the study, you know, in the Midnight Cry message, ultimately it's about bondage to Satan, and are you going to be free or captive? So for too long, let's see, he said we've made this false distinction between sacred and secular.
Satan is really subtle.
Yeah.
He's really sneaky.
Well, because it would seem like it's a good thing,
Right.
but if you never knew it's not a
Yeah.
Christian nation and you didn't remember the roots,
Wow.
you would just think it's right. It's
Yeah.
a good thing to call God back
Wow.
into the country.
He is
Yeah,
so
morally
subtle.
sounds good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you talk against it, you know, you can be seen like a bad person.
Yes.
But understanding the principle, you know,
And the
what's
more we
behind it.
understand that principle, the more, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but that's what we want to understand this principle, because this is going to be the work, like when you were putting up there, the work that comes to the Nephilims,
Yeah.
this is the work that goes to the Nephilims.
Yeah.
And so the ones, there's going to be those that'll hear, and there's going to be those that are going to not. You know what I mean? For those that will hear, we need to understand this, because this is what is going to be for the Nephilims.
That's loud, Mom.
Huh?
Nothing.
So let's see. So he said we've made this false distinction between sacred and secular. He says actually everything is sacred. For too long, we, the pastors, have left business to Wall Street and politics to Washington. But we need to train men of God to work in Wall Street and Washington and turn our country around. If we didn't found it, then if he didn't found it, then he had a great deal of an impact in the forming of the modern religious right. These are some of the names, his being one of them, that say that God is punishing us and we need to come back under his protection by bringing the United States back to God, and they're talking politics and business.
See, when you look at this, if you really understand, you can really see Catholicism that wanted to hold the power, to
Yes,
have the money, the
Yep.
Wall Street,
yeah,
and the government and all this. Exactly. It's
because
like,
they want everything that Catholicism
Yes,
had, power
yeah,
and control, money,
yeah.
all of it. They wanted all of it.
unbelievable.
And that's what the Protestants want.
Whoa.
But they
that's
don't
what
know
the
where it's
Jews
headed.
wanted.
Huh?
That's what the Jews wanted. Whoa.
No new thing under the sun.
Wow.
So in 1861, they introduced this. And in 1863, the phrase, and got to want to put it on the coins. And in 1863, they decide on their phrase. They form their motto that's going to go on their coins. That motto is "In God We Trust." To do that, they had to pass legislation through Congress. In 1865, it begins to be engraved. We went forward about 80 years, and we looked into the 30s, 40s, and the 50s. We started with the history of the Civil War, the introduction of this phrase, "In God We Trust," and it began in 1861, formed in 1863, and the work was completed in 1865. So they introduce it here. The letter goes to the Treasury that we need to recognize God on our coins because we need to turn back to God. Now and then just to remember that that's not what the nation was founded on. Why are they not knowing that in 1861 that this wasn't a Christian nation? And if I understand correctly, looking at Tyler's presentations as well, that they misread. They don't know how to read either, right?
Yep.
They don't know how to read either.
Mhm.
So "In God We Trust," also written as "In God We Trust," is the official motto of the United States of America and the United States of Florida. And I looked that up. I think it was because Florida came in later. I don't remember why it was separated out. It was, I might say that at the bottom, I think. It was adopted by the U.S. Congress in 1956, supplanting "E pluribus unum" in use since the initial 1776 design of the Great Seal of the United States. The capitalized form "In God We Trust" first appeared on the 2-cent piece in 1864 and has appeared on paper currency since 1957. A law passed in a joint resolution by the 84th Congress and approved by President Eisenhower on July 30th, 1956. And Eisenhower is important in all this too, and his role with United Church and State. Requires that "In God We Trust" appear on the American currency. The following year, the phrase was used on paper money for the first time on the updated $1 silver certificate that entered circulation on October 1, 1957. The 84th Congress later passed legislation, also signed by President Eisenhower, July 30th, 1956, declaring the phrase to be the national motto. So that national motto replaced "E pluribus unum," out of many, one. Some groups and people have objected to its use, contending that its religious reference violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. These groups believe the phrase should be removed from currency and public property. In lawsuits, this argument has so far not overcome the interpretational doctrine of accommodationism, which allows government to endorse religious establishments as long as they are treated equally. According to a 2003 joint poll, USA Today, CNN, and Gallup, 90% of Americans support the inscription "In God We Trust" on US coins. So it became the designated motto as well. So, and I know I had in some notes, but whether or not we already did them, I just didn't remember actually doing them, but I went through, maybe somebody remembers the name. You guys might remember because you're from Elk Grove. Newdall, was that his name? What was that? I think it was Newdall. The guy that was
Oh, the lawyer?
yeah, the one that was
Yeah, I can't remember, never remember his name.
in Elk Grove, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I had him included in some notes and I don't remember what happened because we didn't go through them. Maybe they were in the midway notes and I didn't go back that far. But he was fighting.
Under God We Trust.
Yeah.
Absolute.
Yeah. And then it was a violation. His daughter was in the school. Anyway, so
You mean Elk Grove when we had that meeting?
What do you mean? Elk Grove, where we had the what meeting?
Our very first meeting.
Yeah, where yeah, that guy was from Elk Grove.
Oh, okay, no, I'm just, no, never mind then.
Yeah.
I was talking about the very first meeting we ever had at your house about with the message. That's what I thought, because I heard.
Oh, yeah, no.
Okay.
Okay, so then we went into looking at the 40s and 50s. We came to the date 1956. We're going to paraphrase a couple of things. We're accustomed to the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and the phrase in God we trust.
Sister Elaine, Sister Debbie says that 1956 to 2019 is 63 years. Changed to God, I don't know what that is referring.
Yeah, we're coming to that.
Okay.
It's either in this study or the next one, but we're coming to that. Because it does play another role. It connects more dots here. But these haven't existed for as long as we might think. These phrases really came into force in the administration of Eisenhower in the 50s, the same decade that a national prayer breakfast was begun. In the original Pledge of Allegiance, it made no mention of God because they believed in the separation of church and state. How much of what we're about to read will sound familiar depending on how much you've been following what's happening inside the United States. In the 30s and 40s, powerful industrialists or business people were struggling with government regulation of Roosevelt's New Deal program. The New Deal had passed a few different laws that had begun to regulate businesses in some ways for the first time. Businesses weren't used to regulate, and their leaders resented these moves. Did I read that correctly? I'm going to make sure I didn't jump lines. They began to fight with a public relations campaign. What they needed to do and found was the most effective was to tie capitalism to Christianity into the minds of the American people. So you're going to link money, right, to Christianity, like the Jews, right?
Yeah.
And like the Catholics. So the most famous of these organizations they set up was the American Liberty League. They tried to make a case that Christianity and capitalism were connected. The idea is that Christianity and capitalism, you rise and you fall according to your own merit. If you're good, you go to heaven, and if you're bad, you go to hell. In capitalism, if you're good, you make a profit, and if you're bad, you fail. They said that the New Deal violated this God-given order. It encourages Americans to worship the government rather than God. It encourages them to steal from the wealthy by taxes, and they argued that the New Deal is not a manifestation of God's will, but paganism.
Well, that is so interesting. I remember learning about the New Deal over the Roosevelt time. That's interesting, but they didn't talk about this, so yeah, that's interesting.
We're not making this political attack on capital, making it about capitalism, but what was introduced into the American consciousness in the 40s and 50s is what we find being fought over in 2019 and in 2020 will be the same argument. When we think about what America should be and what presenters in this movement say, what they think America should be, they've been giving their arguments, they're giving the arguments of the 1950s, not back in the history before the Civil War when America was raised up. So they're using the same arguments of the 50s and not the history prior to when it comes to the Constitution. They're making the same arguments in this presenters in this movement as well. It's helpful for us to understand what happened in the 50s because the attack on Hillary Clinton is that she's a socialist. The argument against the New Deal, it was creeping socialism. The argument against Clinton is that she stands for taxation. Somebody have a question?
Is that interfering?
You got your echo figured out? Think so, okay. Okay, so the argument against Clinton is that she stands for taxation, the same argument as it was in the 50s. They take these political ideas about taxation, the New Deal, and then connect them to concepts of religion. And it was done intentionally. So there's a little blurb there. I'm going to skip past it, but on the American Liberty League, we will read it. It was an American political organization formed in 1934, primarily of wealthy business elites and prominent political figures who were, for the most part, conservatives opposed to the New Deal of President Franklin Roosevelt. Its principles emphasized private property and individual liberties. Its leader, I don't know if I can say that name, Stuart Schaus, called on its members to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States, to teach the necessity of respect for the rights of persons and property as fundamental to every successful form of government, teach the duty of government to encourage and protect individual and group initiative and enterprise, to foster the right to work, earn, save, and acquire property, and to preserve the ownership and lawful use of property when acquired. It was highly active in spreading its message for 2 years. Following the landslide re-election of Roosevelt in 1936, it sharply reduced its activities and it disbanded entirely in 1940.
You know, President Roosevelt, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was a very political woman too. And she established, I think it was the human, United Nations Human Rights or something like that. I can't remember, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
How many slides do you have? Sorry.
How many?
Left, yeah.
Maybe 20. 20 total. I don't remember why. You have to look at the, oh yeah, you have to look at the main file because I can't tell on this one. The New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt after the Great Depression in 1929. He pulled America out of that, but it was partly through his New Deal, and it required a greater control over businesses. We're not arguing against capitalism, but how they're twisted or manipulated, how they've twisted or manipulated politics, or these arguments against socialism, the same ones that Trump is using and is preparing to use in the 2020 election. They've connected capitalism to the 10 Commandments, and we start to think God would never allow taxes or regulations. You take that to ancient Israel, and if you harvested your field, you know what, I listened to this part because I could not get what word she was using, and it did not make sense to me. And I put I'm going to say what I think it was, but that you go to ancient Israel and you harvested your field, and you had, I don't know if it was one growth, I don't know what word she used, but you got a certain percent, and all the rest was taxes. These religious organizations began where by the end there are thousands of ministers who are preaching sermons to their congregations and sharing these business ideas. So now here's going back to why now we have all these prosperity preachers, right? Because they've connected capitalism to Christianity. And so you got all these prosperity preaching preachers, right? Connected to business corporations, sharing the message. So these pastors they're connected to business corporations, sharing the message that the New Deal is evil, that it's creeping socialism, and it's rotting America from the inside. Instead, they need to rally around their business leaders to protect the American way of life. This is when, under that initiative, the work that was begun in the Civil War comes back during the Eisenhower years, beginning in 1952, that this phrase, "In God We Trust," is pushed again for the second time. So you have the phrase, "In God We Trust," coming in the time of the Civil War. Now we're going into the 50s, and because of what was going on with the New Deal, and calling it creeping socialism and putting regulations on the businesses, you got the pastors now preaching prosperity, linking capitalism to Christianity and preaching prosperity messages. And that's going to lead them again back to the "In God We Trust" phrase.
I want to go back to Roosevelt and just saying that he started getting this nation back out of the Depression.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was World War II that got us out because people started going back to work.
That's interesting that you say that. I remember in my history course and learning that it was through the war that it did get us out the Depression because of, you know, all the booming economy and all of that.
Bombs and planes.
But it was through the New Deal too,
Yeah.
because I can't remember specifically because my professor said that on the test, do not put World War II. That was what got us, because it did play a part in that, but there was more to it than that, and I can't remember exactly.
Maybe somebody knows more about this
Yeah.
than my level of education, but when you look at the Depression, what actually caused the Depression?
I don't know.
Well, I can't remember. I can't remember.
Because their response was to put regulations on businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how that links, but their response was to put regulations. That's what he was doing, is putting regulations on businesses.
Because of
Taxing
greed?
people.
Is that
That's
what
what I'm
greed?
thinking. It probably is. That's the easiest word to put to it. That it probably had to do with greed. But everything was booming, right? And
Yeah.
there was separation of classes too, wasn't
Yeah.
Sounds like 2008.
it? Yeah. Exactly.
They
So-
got out of control with their greed, and then they
Yeah.
had to put, you know,
Yeah.
restraints on them with their
Yeah.
housing market
Yeah.
garbage because it got out of control.
Exactly.
That's exactly what
Exactly.
happened.
So the New Deal was a series of programs, public works projects, financial reforms, and regulations enacted by President Franklin Roosevelt in the United States between 1933 and 1936. It responded to the needs for relief, reform, and recovery from the Great Depression. Major federal programs included the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, Farm Security Administration, National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and the Social Security Administration. They provided support for farmers, the unemployed, youth, and elderly. The New Deal included new constraints and safeguards on the banking industry and efforts to reinflate the economy after prices had fallen sharply. New Deal programs included both laws passed by Congress as well as presidential executive orders during the first term of the President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The programs focused on what historians refer to as the 3 R's: relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery for the economy recovery of the economy back to normal levels, and reform of the financial system to prevent a repeat of the Depression. What have we learned?
Yeah.
The New Deal produced a political realignment, making the Democratic Party the majority, as well as the party that held the White House for 7 out of the 9 presidential terms from 1933 to 1969. With its base in liberal ideas, the South traditional Democrats, big city machines, and newly empowered labor unions and non-whites and ethnic whites. The Republicans were split, with conservatives opposing the entire New Deal as hostile to business and economic growth, and liberals in support. The realignment crystallized into the New Deal coalition that dominated presidential elections into the 60s, while the opposing conservative coalition largely controlled Congress in domestic affairs from 37 to 64. So we come to 1954, and it begins to be placed on stamps. Then in 1955, they start to put it on paper money as well as coins. In 1956, it becomes the official motto of the United States. We discussed the role of Billy Graham and how he also mixed in politics and business. We want to note his influence over Eisenhower. In 1953, Eisenhower is inaugurated, and then we stated just that one week that he was also baptized. He speaks in Back to God campaigns, appears with particularly one prominent pastor at a national prayer breakfast. I think that was the one that we named in the last study, Pastor Varide, and institutes opening prayers at cabinet meetings. Then the influence he has over the Pentagon and all the other agencies have begun to follow him in doing this. So we see 1865, it's engraved. We're gonna
Can you
Well-
repeat? Sorry.
go ahead. What?
Can you repeat?
What I just read here?
No. How it started. And not what you just read, but some of what you just.
It's a scary thing to ask me to repeat sometimes because I can not really remember what I said.
It went through one ear and then it just did not stay.
Well, then
No.
their influence they had over the Pentagon, all the other agencies started doing it. Oh, when I was talking about Pastor Baride, maybe that's what you were asking about. I was just
And
mentioning
how
because it
about
just
you?
talks about the prominent pastor that joined him. It was Pastor Baride. But Billy Graham is linked with Eisenhower, is what we're seeing. And it was the time when they began the National Prayer Breakfast and this linking
But
of.
why is he linked to him? Why is
Billy
Billy
Graham?
Graham? Yeah.
I think we went into him more last time. And I'm trying to remember some of the details of it, but he was very political. Billy Graham was very political and business oriented as well.
Yeah.
So he played a big role in uniting.
Church and state?
Yeah, church.
Yeah, but how does that relate to?
Eisenhower?
Oh, sorry. I'm thinking of Roosevelt. Sorry.
Oh,
It does.
yeah,
Okay,
Eisenhower.
sorry.
So in 1954, under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. We discussed before that this was a secular pledge until 1954. Then in 1956, In God We Trust becomes the official motto of the United States. The United States had an unofficial motto in 1782, E pluribus unum, completely secular meaning out of many, one. Many states, one country. We want to trace these histories, and let's not lose sight of 1861. So we've got here, and I tried to color code things. 1861 takes you to 9/11, and 1865 takes you to 2019. And we'll note what the little star there is, because if you do your math, you'll know that that's not 151 years, and that's not 151 years. Just using it for the structure, and we'll say that, we'll show that in just a minute. But now we have 1956, this other date, and I think that's the one that Debbie was pointing out. The same phrase, In God We Trust, which also takes us to 2019. How does it take us to 2019? It's 63 years, which is half of the 126. So I lined up, color-coded the blues here, the In God We Trust, and the official motto here, all linking, and then the 1956 then again links to 2019. So all these things involve that's the right word to say, the uniting of church and state. If you want to say theme, go back to that word theme. So we want to trace In God We Trust in this history, in our history. In March of 2001, there's a governor, Ronnie Musgrove in Mississippi, and he signs a bill into law in 2001. If you feel like we're being too hard on Republicans, this guy's a Democrat, so we can feel better. There were Democrats in the North to win the Civil War. This fellow is on the wrong side because he signs a law that requires In God We Trust to be placed in all public schools. It must be displayed at every one of their classrooms, their cafeterias, every room in the public schools.
What was his justification for doing that?
Ronnie Musgrove. We'll read the bottom here and see what more we can find out. But similar reasons, bringing God back into the nation. And this is 2001. So let's see here.
9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah. This fellow's on the wrong side. Let's see, and it must be displayed in every. And this was the first state to pass this legislation. So it's after 9/11. I've got a timeline here too, and it doesn't look like the whole timeline is there, but it's in the other notes. It's in the other notes. That might be the whole thing. Maybe it didn't go all the way through. So this was the first state to pass. So after 9/11, here's a Democrat that is actually fighting for a law to bring back in God We Trust. So same issue coming again. You got Civil War, you got the 50s, and now you have 9/11 bringing the same issue. So Governor Ronnie Musgrove has signed a law requiring public schools to display In God We Trust in classrooms, cafeterias, and auditoriums. Our nation was founded as a godly nation, and we put it on our money. In God We Trust, said Mr. Musgrove, who signed the bill on Friday, as the American Civil Liberties Union threatened to bring suit. The group maintains that requiring a reference to God in public classrooms violates the constitutional guarantee of separation of church and state. See, these things were all going on. I don't know how many of you guys, but I wasn't paying attention
Me
to
either.
see the link.
Well, I was probably just, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I wasn't seeing the link of what that meant.
I was
So
way
really,
younger.
you really look at this stuff and realize how much we could have known.
Yep.
So like the U.S. Supreme Court, we believe the best way to protect religious freedom is by keeping religion and government separate. And, so here's just a historical timeline. I found this one on one of the sites. I think it was at the same place where I found the information on, I think his name was Newdall. But it's in your notes if you want to go back through and read it. Seems like some of the dates are not quite the same as what she says. So, you know, I'm going forward in faith. You know what I'm talking about? I'm going forward in faith because we know that histories can be made a mess of too. So, but you see here, 1861, you got the Watkinson here, lobbies the Treasury, right? And then 64, God We Trust appears on the 2-cent piece. Congress authorizes the change. That's significant too, I believe, because Congress had to authorize it. So when they're clamoring for a Sunday law, or they're clamoring for a union of church and state, Congress has to
Wow.
authorize it.
That's so interesting.
So the preparation for the Sunday law, church and state, it's happening for a long time.
For a long time.
Adventism didn't see
For a
it.
long time.
Wow.
From where she says that the image of the beast is to be formed before the close of probation.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah,
image of
but
the beast.
see, before our close of probation, that's the thing.
Yes. What were you gonna say?
Like this is progress, and
Yeah, progression.
it just goes little step by step.
And they never learned their lesson.
And so that's the way Satan works, because he ain't gonna do it all at once. He likes to sneak in here a little there,
Yeah.
and before you know it.
So you know, and like she said, it sounds like a good thing. Morally, it sounds like a really good thing.
Yeah.
Put God back in because everything's a mess.
Yeah.
Well, our schools are a mess, and that one argument is because they don't have, nobody has any concept of the 10 Commandments or the of right and wrong. So they need to bring that in and show fear God into them.
Yeah.
Their argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know that in every crisis, that's what they do.
They
Do
go
you
back, they
notice
start trying
that?
to
They'll
bring God
say,
back in.
yeah, exactly. In every crisis, I just
It
noticed.
goes all the way
time.
back to the Civil War.
Yeah, every time. Oh, the reason why these troubles are here is because people are living ungodly and doing all this crazy stuff, and then this is why this is happening. Just like in Sodom and Gomorrah, all of this stuff is happening, and then people reason at that because they go back and they look like, hey, Sodom and Gomorrah did get destroyed for all of what was going on through that time, and then people really resonate with that. And so then they agree, like, this is true. This world is crazy. You know, people are living lawlessly, you know, and stuff. And it does sound good what they're saying, you know, and so it's very subtle because you would never know that.
Because most people here are usually raised in some kind of Christian and then they
Right.
leave. But in a moment of crisis where they're confronted with death, they're like, well, I need to go to heaven. I need to. And then SDA Church, Doug says, wow, there sure are a lot of people here after 9/11 in my church. You know,
Right.
everyone is freaking out, scared that they're
Yeah.
going to die. And they're like, I need to turn to God immediately before it's too late to get into
Exactly.
heaven. And they're like, we need to get God back in schools. You know,
Mhm, yeah.
it's a self-serving thing. When you're supposed to love him when you have good times.
Amen.
You know, not just like get something out of him when you have bad times, just to use him for protection. And then when things are good again, then you go do your own thing again.
Yeah.
They call
Amen.
it go that deathbed conversion. Everybody
Deathbed, yeah, deathbed.
Yeah.
It is true that God is judging.
Amen.
But,
That's true.
you know, the religious world is using that
What?
for getting up in prosperity
Yeah.
instead of bringing people back to God. And it is easy to use some beautiful words, but what's behind it?
Amen.
And when you go back to the Civil War, well, what does Ellen White say the cause of the Civil War was? Or the punishment of the Civil War?
Slavery.
She links it to slavery, right?
Yeah.
And what did they link it to? What were the North linking their losses to?
Yeah, they wanted more slavery.
So they were linking it to, we need to bring God back in. So the United States forgot its job function,
Mhm.
right?
Wow.
And so did the church when they rejected the prophecies. They no longer understood their job function.
Mm.
So 126 years later, 151 years later, depending on which waymark you're looking at, 1989, 2014, that we forgot we don't even know our job function.
Mm.
We don't even know it.
Can I say something real quick before you
Mhm.
continue? Sister Susan says that she's referring back to the 3 R's. Maybe I'm just weird, but the 3 R's seem in reverse for us. Reform first, then recovery comes to us when we receive the reform lines. Then we can bring relief to others with the truth we learn and accept. Chiasm, maybe?
She has such a neat way of saying things. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to.
No, Susan always comes up with some really interesting, good things. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
So, and just to point out that the 151, because it came part of the discussion, this 151 here, because when you do the math, this is not 151 years and this is not 151 years. It's just kind of placed there symbolically because of this structure to line it up with, to the structure down here is why the 151 is marked there. So the little star there, asterisk, is that it's not an actual 151 years. This one is an actual 151 years, but just to make the structures all match, that's why it's placed there.
Brother,
So you can take or leave that out of there.
Brother Jonathan adds, evangelism is what Adventism believes is their job function. Evangelism, but they don't have a message.
Correct. They want to evangelize, but they don't know what they're supposed to be evangelizing. Right.
Yeah.
In 2001, in Mississippi, it becomes a law that In God We Trust must be placed in public schools. We're going to quote Barry W. Lynn, a minister who is also the director of an institution called Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. This is the first state that has done what many have threatened to do. He says it's one thing to put it on coins, but this takes children as captive audience and compels them to read religious doctrine in their schools. Now, I can say that I would have just looked at a statement like that many years ago and thought, how silly is that? What's the big deal, right?
But
that's why we need to understand our roots.
Do you see that Satan hitting children everywhere?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What'd you say?
Satan hitting children everywhere.
Hides.
He hits the children.
Hits.
Oh, hits.
With all his
Subtleties.
all this stuff. It's the children with the prayer, the children with the Christmas. Halloween is the children. All this kind of stuff, he goes to the children because you educate them like this, and when they grow up, they don't know anything anymore.
Yeah. So, but the government in Mississippi took a particular approach, and their excuse for placing it in their schools is that they say it can be placed in the schools because we've already placed it on the currency. So if it's on our currency, why can't it be in our schools? The decisions in these histories are the justifications for doing it in 2001. We want to mark 1954, under God becomes part of the Pledge of Allegiance. So the kids are reciting that Pledge of Allegiance.
I had to recite that Pledge of Allegiance when I was younger in school.
You're claiming that the nation is one nation under God when you don't know your roots, that it's not a Christian nation.
Yeah. I didn't even know. I thought
Me neither.
Yeah.
So none of us, you know what I mean? And it's amazing what we could have known.
Well,
But people knew. Stones were crying out. That Noodle, he's crying out, and people wrote him off as a nutcase, right? If I remember right, they wrote him off as a nutcase. He was divorced, and his wife was a Christian. He's an atheist, and I might have the name wrong, but I think it was Noodle. And he's an atheist, and he's not wanting his daughter to have to recite under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah. So I think that's what he was fighting against. He was fighting against the coins as well, but he was fighting against, I think it was against the Pledge of Allegiance. So, he winds up taking it. I'm pretty sure that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he still lost.
Wow.
If I remember right. Maybe somebody can look that up, but it's funny because I know I had some of the stuff that he had done in one of these studies, but I couldn't find it when I went back and looked for it. So Barry W. Lynn, born in 1948, was the executive director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State from 1992 to November 2017. He is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a prominent leader of the religious left in the United States. He is known to be a strong advocate for separation of church and state. So there's a minister that's standing up for the right side.
If you guys go to the Americans United website, they list a lot of things because they keep a sharp eye on this.
See,
Why do you mention that? What do they say?
They're Americans United Against Church and State Combination. She just said, because we had looked at them before in our devotional in the morning, and the article from their side that I was looking at, they were exposing the Blitz movement, the Blitz, is it movement? Whatever it's called, the Blitz push.
The Blitz Project or something?
Yeah, something Blitz.
Project Blitz.
Project Blitz, thank you.
Project Blitz.
Thank you so much. That was
Yeah.
gonna drive me nuts. But yeah, Project Blitz. So Americans United, what they do is in every single state, they keep an eye on any kind of legislation that they see being pushed that's a uniting of church and state. And they started to see a pattern of the same kind of bill being pushed in every single legislative body in every single state. And they're like, what is going on? It's like the religious right are all uniting to push this one kind of idea in. And they cut and paste basically to fit whatever state. They the same wording and everything. So they're like, it's the same bill. What's going on? And they found out that that's Project Blitz. They're trying to push as much legislation in, and it's the Americans United were watching that. So
Wow.
these are the stones.
yeah.
Yeah, there's stones that are crying out.
Maybe they're the ones plowing the Nephilim.
So just a quick review, when it comes to this Millerite structure, giving us this structure of 6 months and a midpoint, gave us this period of time of a midpoint, marking it using the 151, taking you back to 1863, got midpoint here as well. And back here in the Civil War, they're working on bringing in God We Trust. Come into the history of Eisenhower. This is a history as well as Billy Graham. Prior to here in the 30s and 40s, you have the Roosevelt and the New Deal, the recovery from the Depression, putting regulations on businesses. And now you've got this group that comes in that wants to link Christianity to capitalism. And then you start developing prosperity preachers. Preachers are involved in politics. Billy Graham winds up with great influence over Eisenhower. They bring the Pledge of Allegiance, add under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, and then in God We Trust becomes the official motto. And then you see in 2001, you have the same thing starting all over again after 9/11. So this was the result of the Civil War. This was a result of the New Deal and the regulations. This is a result of 9/11. And that God is punishing us. So the same thing is here. God is punishing us. We need to turn back to God. We need to turn back to God. So this push has been going on all along, and we didn't know our job, right? So we'll look at March 2017 and note that it's also 63 years from 1954. So there's another one here that takes you to 2017, 1954. So this legislation has been happening progressively in this history, state by state. In March of 2017, it becomes law in Arkansas that In God We Trust must be placed in their schools. So keep in mind that from 9/11, it's been state by state progressively, okay? 2017 is marking a significant spot in Arkansas. And it's a law called Act 911. And I did put, the link is here for anybody that wants to open it up and read it, but this was the bill, and it was just 2 pages there to read, quick, easy read, but just how the bill read out. I didn't put it all there, but I put the link there. So it's a law, Act 911. It's been happening since 2001, and we know that in 2018, another state joins. So it's been happening progressively through this history from 2001. But in Arkansas, it comes in 2017, and there's something about Arkansas, and it's not a coincidence that this is the Clintons' hometown. It's not a coincidence it's 63 years after 1954. In March, they passed Act 911, and In God We Trust entered their public schools in Arkansas.
What's Act 911? I mean, I know it's a bill, but I wonder why they came up with the name Act
Because of
911.
2001.
Yeah,
9/11.
I know, I get that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they put Act 911 though.
To prevent further attacks, we need to add God into our school.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah.
They connect everything
Back to 9/11. And
with everything that affected the wealth of United States. So if you say anything against it, you will be seen like a really bad person.
And another thing I wanted to point out is that, because we still use in Alberta, she said we need to use Steve Bannon as a connection for Sunday law. He was far more liberal until 9/11. Once 9/11 hit, that radicalized him, and he moved conservative, right wing, far right wing. So 9/11
Put the fear of
radicalized.
God in him.
Sure, it seems to have, because he was still over all the wealth and everything, and when he saw what that did to us, he was like, well.
I'm converted.
Yeah. But yeah, so you can connect him back to that too. We have our article.
It was Steve Bannon, Brother Jonathan. Steve Bannon.
So this is the type of thing that A.T. Jones fought Congress over, and we're sleeping through this history. So you think about it, from 2001, you look at what A.T. Jones was fighting back in 1888, 1893, but you know what he was fighting for, and we're not fighting. We're just waiting for a Sunday law.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're just waiting for a Sunday law, and yet here they are doing it right under our noses, and we don't even know it because we don't know how to read correctly. So this is what A.T. Jones fought Congress over and over, and we're sleeping through this history. If we sleep through this, we will sleep through Sunday law, because Adventism as a whole is waiting for a big neon sign, and I don't think they're going to ever get it, partly because they've slept through this history.
The other thing is that I think I remember, even as a kid, hearing on the news that they were going to add this, and they were having this whole discussion around 9/11 about religion in schools. And Adventism was hopeful that they would bring religion into schools because they had Protestantism so indoctrinated so successfully into them that they thought it was a good idea. And on the back end saying, yo, watch out for that Sunday law. You know, they don't. It was just
I'm just as guilty of not understanding it either.
Me too.
I was the same. I was like, we need guidance.
Yes.
Me too.
You were wrong.
But I think, I don't know, does it count in being a young person?
Yeah.
Because I was like 11.
I don't know.
See, I didn't understand the issue, but I was never with the prayer in school. I did not agree with that.
For me, I guess my justification would be that I love God, and so I was thinking, God is,
like
I know, God is,
school and talk about
exactly,
God. Yeah.
exactly. But then again though, because if you ever mention, I mean, not saying that you're even trying to convert or whatever, talk to someone about Jesus, you doing your own thing, you want to say grace, right? You're in school, you want to say grace over your food, but then you're kind of shy because, you know, other people can see you're not even trying to witness about them, but you're just saying grace before you have your lunch, and you're fearful of doing that because you got all these other people who don't believe in God and all of that, who's going to tease you or whatsoever.
So you're thinking this makes it easier.
Exactly, kind of, you know, but at the same time, you're not trying to force anybody to pray or anything like that, but you still yourself don't want to be ridiculed or persecuted because you choose to believe in God and say grace and all these other things.
Yeah.
You know?
So I tried to back up a few presentations because when she writes Brother Heber, I've just left it there as it was because she's referring to Brother Heber, one of the students, a quote that he put in there, and it was quotes that was with A.T. Jones. And
Heber, I see him on the Bible study all the time.
Huh?
The brother you're talking about.
Yeah, and I was trying to find the quote, the specific quote, but I couldn't find it. So, but it goes back to A.T. Jones, I believe. So we put another layer on this history, and that was what began in 1863. Again, it talks about the war not going good for the North and Republicans. Prior to 1863 and the Battle of Gettysburg, the Republicans are losing in the Civil War, and they're losing prior to 2014 under Obama. So pastors from 11 different denominations met in Ohio. This is back during the Civil War. What they're saying was God is angry and that we're not being divinely protected because our governments are not recognizing God and enforcing moral law. And they were never to enforce moral law. So in 1863, they formed the National Reform Movement. And these are things that A.G. Jones fought about later, but this was the beginning of the National Reform Movement.
The governments always enforce the moral law.
Huh?
The governments always enforce the moral law. I mean, you have don't steal, don't kill, don't. It's all in the state law.
Civil law.
Civil law, yeah.
Civil law. Yeah, but when it comes to morality, you can choose to, as I put it to someone the other day, you can choose to live together unmarried. You can choose to be homosexual. Your morality was your own choice. But when it comes to civil law, stealing, breaking the law in that aspect, that's what they enforce, but they weren't to enforce moral law.
Mm-hmm.
Moral, the way they see it.
Yeah, yeah. How they read.
Yeah.
But the judicial system was to interpret law. That was their job, right?
But not moral law.
Right, exactly.
But not morality.
Yeah.
They were
exactly.
they were not to dictate morality.
Right.
What do you mean? The Jewish law?
No, we're talking about
Judicial.
judicial system.
Oh, judicial.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wait a
judicial.
minute. Okay.
Yeah.
So in 1863, they formed the National Reform Movement. That gave our pioneers so much to do and so much to fight. They're saying the government is not acknowledging Christianity, the Christian roots of our nation, which it was not Christian roots, right? And they're not enforcing morality. They're saying, huh?
The deist roots of our nation.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. Sorry, I just want
No,
to
that's
add
okay.
one thing. Is because the Pilgrims, when they came over, they were Christian.
Yes, but they
Exactly.
fled
The person.
They fled the persecution of a
From
union
Rome.
of church and state.
Right. Exactly.
They came for freedom.
Yeah.
Not for religion.
So if someone is referring back to them as this being a Christian nation because it was established by Christian people, then they're interpreting it wrong.
Right.
I can only see that's what they're going back to as far as it being a Christian nation, because it was established by Christians, right? But it wasn't, but when those Christians created this law, they were not, they created this nation to be under the right to choose, the freedom of who you want to serve and what you want to do, but within limits, but not on a moral basis, if that makes sense.
And that's why I think that chapter, the Pilgrim Fathers, is so important in the Great Controversy for people out there in the world, because it shows when the Pilgrims came what their purpose was and what they were trying to do. It also shows they failed multiple times, that it always seemed to take them back to a place unintentionally of bringing God back in. Unintentionally. You know what I'm saying? It's how we all do things unintentionally, not realizing it, not knowing the end from the beginning. That's why God's showing us the beginning so we can know the end, right?
Yeah.
So we can see it in real time.
Something I learned recently, which I didn't know this, is that at the beginning of this country, they didn't have set political parties, and they actually believed against that because they thought it would just bring to division. But after the Civil War, they broke into two parties, and the one always put in check the other, because they always kept trying to keep bringing back church and state. You can see that from the very beginning, the fathers and everything, but having that liberal side always held the other in check.
Yeah.
So they ended up having to split. I was looking at, and then the red and blue that we have, I didn't know this, but when it first came out, when you have the maps of what candidate gets what, they were actually switched. So Republicans were blue, and then, anyways, there's a whole other, but they didn't have political parties, but when they split, one kept the other in check, and you maintained a democracy.
One of the things I remember reading in that chapter, I'm pretty sure it was in that chapter, that one of the areas that they failed was more and more people started to come to this nation for prosperity, because they saw that these ones were beginning to prosper and they wanted to join in the prosperity, so they came here. They wanted to settle with them, if I'm remembering this correctly. They wanted to settle with them, and so for them, they wanted to protect their right to their religious beliefs. So they said, well, you can join our town or what have you, but you have to be our religion. So they wind up making the same mistakes repeatedly along the way.
If it's the freedom.
Yeah.
Christians
Because-
don't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's fine.
No,
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that Christians, when they look back into history, they don't go back far enough. They go back to a time when it appeared to be a Christian nation, with the founders and everything, but they don't go back far enough to remember why these Christians came to America in the first place. And they were coming to escape religious oppression, and they came to develop a place of religious liberty. But quickly it kind of changed. I don't even know that it changed. It's just that we look back on it and we say, see, it was a Christian nation because most of the people that were here, if not all of them, were Christian. But the thing is, they were the ones that were escaping the religious oppression at that time, and they were coming to develop a religious liberty. So they're not going back far enough. They're going back and saying, we need to defend the religion of this country, which is obviously a Christian country because it's always been Christian. But it was only Christian because they were the ones that were escaping oppression. I don't know if I've kind of circled around that a couple times.
No, I get what you're saying.
Wait, can you? Yeah, I didn't follow.
Oh.
Sister Lee.
You can have him repeat it. I got what you were saying.
Okay, Brother Jonathan, can you kind of repeat what you said?
I'll try to do this through one straight history. So today we're looking backwards and we're saying the United States is obviously a Christian country because we look at the founding fathers, and even though some of them weren't, might have been deist or whatever they were, we recognize them as Christians and that there were Christian principles that were being instituted into the Constitution, just a couple hundred years ago. So this is what Christians like to do, is that they like to go back to that history and say, look, it was Christians that were making this country what it is today. But what they're not doing is they're not going back far enough into history and recognizing why were we even here in the first place?
Yeah.
Going back to the period in Europe where the oppression was, where the people that left that Europe at that time, the only thing they wanted was to be able to worship their religion freely, and they would have equally respected anyone to do so in a land where they could all do that. So we're not going back far enough and recognizing what these Christians, the Pilgrims, what they truly wanted. We're only looking.
Are you done?
Yeah.
So they forget history, right? They forget history, and then also they forget the mistakes. They didn't learn from mistakes.
Another thing is, some people like me, or people that came here from other countries for religious freedom, they don't realize that the religious freedom is for state to stay out of religion. They came here looking at United States like being a Christian nation.
To protect their Christianity.
They don't know history. They don't
Yeah.
know how United States started. They look at United States being a Christian nation where they can have their religion and be free.
Interesting, because the whole world is getting a view of history now.
Well, sorry to interrupt her. But that's because when they would do those missionary trips, to other countries, from the U.S. to other countries, doing their product, spreading democracy and also, I'm probably mixing it up because you have Protestants who would go over to other countries and efforts to spread the gospel, and so they have that kind of impressed in their minds. But then you also have people from the U.S. also spreading democracy and whatever they're having, here as a Christian. So what they get from those who's going over, overseas to spread is what their idea of what the United States is all about. And what they see from them is what they want for themselves. So when they do come here, I'm hoping this is making sense. When they do come here, that's what they're expecting. That's what they're expecting from what they're getting from those who are going over there. But it's interesting.
So we got.
May I just remark?
Yeah, go ahead.
to my mind, it strikes me that there ends up being a limitation on what people come to understand. I think of Nebuchadnezzar and how he, at one point towards the end, wants to issue a decree that everyone has to worship the God that Daniel worships. He had come around and been converted, but his understanding was still limited. And you bring history all the way up through the train of history, and you can bring it into Protestant America. And the founders were fleeing something, but they still didn't want to let go of everything they understood. And, Sister White talks about that in every age. Lutheranism, Martin Luther came up so far, and God is always wanting to call up higher, but many times individually or as a movement, we draw back and we limit our understanding for any number of motivations, any number of reasons. Trump, make America great again. Part of what that is hearkening back to feeds into this very narrative of the U.S. being a Christian nation.
He wants to go back to this history here.
That's right. Exactly, Elaine.
That's interesting. Who would think Trump would want to go back to that history?
Because the prosperity and what they were doing it for prosperity.
I got it.
So you got 1863 is the National Reform Movement. When you get to our history, you've got 2001. That's when they start bringing back in God We Trust and making it, wanting to establish it in the states. And Mississippi was the first one. You got a progressive work here until you get to Arkansas, Act 911, where they started bringing it into their schools in Arkansas. And you continue on going forward. So it's been an ongoing work that has been coming in. So let's see if we can figure out. Saying because the country is going to be judged, so they're going to bring this movement to bring America back to God. Everything A.G. Jones fights in 1888 and in 1893 stems from these actions, the formation of the National Reform Movement. We'll paraphrase from A.T. Jones. He says in February of 1863, an organized movement began composed of the Protestant churches that was designed to compel the government to recognize their Christian religion and adopt and enforce Sunday. What's interesting about this history, it takes us all the way back to Acts 27. In 1863, the ship goes off course. The ship equals the United States and Adventism. Both begin in 1798. Then every single waymark, 1798 to 1844, you can connect Adventism and the United States. So I don't have 1798 on here, but you have here where they're in Cnidus, where they go off course in 1863. So, and we see this same battle, and apparently it's in the news. I've seen it on several of the articles that I've been reading. They're calling this, there's going to be civil war. They don't know they've already been in civil war all this time.
Yeah, but can you break down I know and what A.T. Jones is saying here? I'm only asking because she did reference him as bad, right? Because he's in conspiracy theories. A.T. Jones? Or am I getting it confused?
I think you got that confused.
Alex Jones. Sorry.
Yeah, Alex Jones, yeah.
Thinking of Alex Jones. Sorry.
That's okay. So the Christian Amendment describes any of several attempts to amend the United States Constitution by inserting explicitly Christian ideas and language. The most significant such attempt began during the American Civil War and was spearheaded by the National Reform Association. And just going back into what you just said, it's like, it makes you think because you always want to say, okay, now what story are you talking about first? And so I'm racing through my head, A.T. Jones, no, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It makes me at least stop and think instead of be so quick to say no. You know what I mean? So with everything we've been learning. So, okay, so in February 1863, during the American Civil War, a coalition of 11 Protestant denominations from 7 northern states gathered to discuss the state of the nation. seeing the Civil War as God's punishment for their omission of God from the Constitution, they discussed, it was a perfect document, right? It was a perfect document. Now that's one place you can say, I can't imagine how many times have we heard that it was a perfect phone call, lovely phone call, perfect. And I was just, I hear it, it's like, that word perfect is like, you know, when you tell a lie over and over and over again, people believe it, begin to believe it. And I just think that's exactly what he does, because he repeats the same things about that phone call over and over and over and over again.
What phone
Trump, Donald Trump. The phone call with the Ukrainian president.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I thought you were all following me.
Yeah, I do know.
You guys were all following.
No, I
You
know,
did,
I
didn't you?
know. No, I know about that.
Yeah,
but
yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were following me, sorry.
But how
We're
does,
not
what
supposed
does,
to know.
what does that have to do with the Constitution being the perfect
Sorry.
document?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
what I
this
was
is where my
wondering.
head went.
That's what I was wondering.
Because in here, we were just reading it, that the Constitution, I'm the one that brought up that it was a perfect document. They're saying that we need to add Christian ideas and language into the Constitution. So seeing the Civil War was God's punishment for the omission of God in the Constitution. So I'm going back in my thoughts to what we've been understanding about the Constitution. It was just the way God wanted it.
Right, but
It was just the way God wanted
still,
it.
how does that connect to the phone? Perfect.
That would mean you're saying the Constitution isn't perfect.
No, I was saying the Constitution is perfect. It's a correct use of the word for the Constitution.
Oh.
But he's using perfect to try to get you to believe his phone call was perfect.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Now I get what you're
I'm sorry you guys can't
You
be
got
inside my
it?
head.
You got it? Okay, good.
I'm sorry you can't be inside my head. Perspective. Did everybody else, I'm sorry if I caused confusion. Did everybody catch on what I was talking about?
I missed the whole, I didn't really, I was kind of distracted on my own.
Okay. Well, that probably works too then.
The other question is, at what point was the Constitution perfect? Because we had the amendments that came afterwards, and they were also important.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about what Brother Tyler's been bringing out about the Constitution, between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that the separation of church and state, that God is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, right, but not in the Constitution. And it was purposeful to be there. And so when you have two sides externally not knowing how to read, and then you have us internally not knowing how to read, right? So you get perspective and being taken, but the Constitution was written just the way God wanted it. So I'm sorry for the sidetrack. It's just where my mind went.
John, I think I would put that at 1887 when it was originally made. It didn't have any amendments yet because it didn't have any other issues that weren't clarified because people were reading it wrong. But the way it was, it said all men are created equal, and people have the right to da-da-da, and all persons have the right to do this and that. So it didn't have any slavery in it or gender in it.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that is the fact that the Constitution, if you kind of look at it, I don't know if I can do this or not, but if you look at it, it's the first angel's message, and the amendments, that's the second angel's message. And the Constitution was perfect for what it was, for the time that it served. And then when the amendments came, they had to come. It didn't do away with the Constitution, but it was a necessary addition to the Constitution for the progressing truth, I guess.
Amen. So exactly, it still reigns as perfect, even though you have those amendments there, because the way the Constitution was constructed, like when you're thinking of the structure, even what Sister Christina brought out earlier, you know, that each dispensation, you know, there's new stuff, but at the same time, that whole doctrine itself, or the movement itself, is perfect, if that makes sense.
Oh, sorry, it was the trigger of the word perfect that triggered me on that other side. It just seems like we've heard him say that probably 150 times, that his call was perfect.
I didn't hear that
part of that is not just that he said it, it's just that the media keeps repeating the same video over and over.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is true.
Because everywhere I look on every day, use all that same clip of him in
I
the.
remember that.
Yes.
But I don't, because I'm not hearing that over and over.
Yeah.
I guess it's not being in my head.
So anyway, so they discussed a proposed amendment to alter the wording of the preamble to acknowledge God. The idea that, and so we didn't put him in there, and now they're wanting to correct their behavior. They're wrong, their error, that we're being punished, and we need to correct our error by putting God in the Constitution when God was not to be in the Constitution. So to acknowledge, let's see, the idea that civil governments derive their legitimacy from God and Jesus in particular was alleged to be based on biblical passages such as Psalm 2 and Romans 13.
Mm-hmm.
I think this might be our last slide. I'm not sure. But I'm not sure. Okay. So the ship's going on a journey from 1798 to Sunday law, and it represents both the United States and Adventism. Both get to 1863, and both go off course, and they're off course all the way through this history. If we were to discuss Adventism, we would talk about a progressive destruction of our prophetic message until we come to the history of 2019. In 1863, they're forsaking the 2520. In 2019, most people haven't even heard of it. And then, wow.
Yeah, that's the airplane.
Sometimes I think they're gonna take me home.
Yeah, wow. This is way close down here. Okay, so she's going to reference church in Australia now. People in Australia are rejecting the 2300 days, even if they've heard of it. And Sister Tess, she talks about her church pastor has never even heard of investigative judgment, no idea what it was. They have hardly any understanding of prophecy or Millerite history. What they do have, they don't understand. We come to 1989 and there's darkness and nothing left. In our minds, we are that far removed from what God had raised us up to be, the fourth generation. We compare and contrast. The United States has been off course since 1863, and we speak to the churches and we ask what America should be, or Trump says, make America great again, and everything that he's describing about that, the way he wants it to be, he takes it back to the 1950s. We wouldn't be able to get up in America today and pull out a dollar bill and point to "In God We Trust" and say that should not be there. That's church and state. So you can't just go tell people that because they're just always been there. If we understand the condition of Adventism, we have to recognize that the United States is in the same condition.
You know what's interesting? Because next to that, because when you take that same dollar bill and show "In God We Trust," what do Adventism do think about? The Illuminati.
Yeah.
Masons.
Yep, Illuminati.
Yeah.
They're on a wrong, they're on a, yeah, exactly. They're on a whole nother level of thinking.
Yep.
Wow. Interesting.
So his people, and that's another lie of Satan to have us always stay in darkness.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, it's really interesting too, because it comes down to what tickles your ears, right?
Yeah.
And so we tend to, as human, the creatures that we are, we tend to like things that tickle our ears, and we like things that, you know, curiosity, all that kind of stuff. So Satan knows how to play us and work us.
But that was
praise
like
God that he's brought us out of that darkness.
Amen. But that was a big thing though at that time though.
Yeah.
And studying those things and seeing all these satanic symbols and the all-seeing eye and the triangle and all of that stuff, you know.
Twisting it all to make it be something that, when E pluribus unum never had anything to do with what they said.
Yeah. Wow.
So his people have no idea what it was raised up to be, because the image of what it was raised to be has been progressively destroyed from 1863 until we come to a history where there's complete darkness. Placing "In God We Trust," forming that phrase by the government as a model for their coins, is the external of rejecting the 2520. We lost our way and they lost theirs. We've had to do so much unlearning to wake up to what God wants of Adventism. We have to expect the same for the United States and for the Constitution if we compare and contrast the two entities. I think there's an air show.
I was just thinking.
I think there is, because yesterday when I took that drive, there were signs when I went through that area for leading the traffic through. So I'm pretty sure there's an air show. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but it is pretty loud. Okay, so Ecclesiastes 1:9, your favorite. The thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. A new effort to overthrow our government. But attempts to overthrow this government have not been abandoned. What could not be directly accomplished by force of arms is now sought by a more peaceful but more subtle and dangerous means. So it's peaceful morality, right? It seems like a good thing to bring God back into the
Yeah, it
schools and all
did
that,
at the
but
time.
more subtle and dangerous.
Right.
A party has arisen in our nation hostile to that conception of government set forth in the memorable address of President Lincoln, and which aims at nothing less than the overthrow of that ideal and the establishment of the theocratic government in its stead. A new slavery now threatens not one portion of the people merely, but all classes. A slavery which would take away freedom of conscience and bind about the soul the chains of religious despotism. This party have laid siege to our National Congress and intend to prosecute the siege until Congress capitulates and enacts for them such legislation as will place all Christian institutions and usages upon an undeniable legal basis in the fundamental law of the land. And they have succeeded in drawing to their aid almost the entire religious forces of the land. They demand that the national constitution shall be so amended as to recognize Jesus Christ as the ruler of nations, and his will as being of supreme authority in civil affairs. Under such a constitution, American citizens of every class would inevitably become the victims of legislation which seeks to bind the conscience, regulating it by congressional action. The individual conscience, it is said, must yield to the conscience of the whole people, which is over him and should be over him. And it's interesting when you think about what we've been understanding about equality and what God is seeking to do in freedom, that this is a overall the ultimate in slavery, returning us back to the Dark Ages, returning us, making us a Christian nation. I lost my thoughts. I had some particular thoughts that I wanted to put into that, but anyways, I think it's a really powerful statement that it's a new slavery now threatens not one portion of the people, but all classes. So it's going to take away your freedom of conscience. And I know what I was going to say, because they want to make Christ as the ruler of the nations, is his will being supreme. And you know, the whole thing about the freedom and the kingdom, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is it's going to be this freedom to choose. Those that are going to choose to be in his kingdom have chosen of their own free will to be in that kingdom.
Amen. And you know, the Lord put on my mind this morning about the law. So you know how in your job you're your own entrepreneur, but and one who works in the workforce under like a boss and supervisor, things like that. You know, in that kind of setting, you have rules and laws that protects you, because when you're in a situation with a client or somebody, and they're wanting you to act outside of that law, or they're being inappropriate and you have to handle that, you can always go back to your boss and say, well, that's not how we do things here. You know, my you know, the rule here is that I can't do this or that, blah, blah, blah. You can always go back to that law that's set in place at your job force. So it actually protects you. But when you act outside of that rule, or that kind of law of your workplace and how things goes in order to try to suit a patient or whatever else, yourself or whatever it may be, then you no longer have protection because you acted outside of that law. So you can't go back to your supervisor and say, well, this patient is doing this so-and-so, and can you handle this? You're going to get in trouble and you no longer have that protection because you acted outside that law. And that made me think back to God's law, because that law is protection. It's freedom. You have the freedom to act and do as you please as long as it's within that law. But once you act outside of that law, you no longer have that protection. So that protection actually, that law protects you and provides you that freedom, if that makes sense. And that's what the Constitution is supposed to do for people in the United States. For those who abide by the law, you are protected. You have the freedom to be in pursuit of happiness and why am I forgetting? Liberty,
Life,
happiness,
liberty,
life.
the pursuit of happiness.
Yes, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness under the Constitution. But when you act outside that, you no longer have the protection of the law behind you, because you're acting outside of that. So I just thought that was interesting. I hope that made sense. But
We do have a few more slides, and I'm not sure how far. So no, you're okay. And so just letting her know there are a few more slides. So we got till 1:30. So
yeah.
okay, so this is where this study is interesting. Not that it's a pretty picture, but it gives us a compare and contrast where we can actually see why the United States is the way it is now. We can primarily take it back to these histories in the Civil War, at least from this perspective, which is particularly tracing the phrase "in God we trust," as it was in the Civil War, as it was in the Civil War, as it was in the 1950s, and as it has been since 2001. And the push inside America as they face radical Islam, what they would also call creeping socialism, secularization, the same push to bring the nation back to God. That was realized with the election of Donald Trump. And he's bringing that language back, but it didn't start with him. He's not the only one pushing that. He's just the puppet at the top. He's only primarily there because the religious people of America voted for him because they believe the nation needs to be brought back to God in a time of crisis. To them, it's a crisis that they're not in charge, I guess. So this is a comment from the students to highlight how much, and this is the one that I started to say earlier, to highlight how much we were to understand how Adventism was raised. What was Adventism raised for? Even if we understand why Adventism was formed in the first place, if the people who understand it don't even understand why America was raised in the first place, seems to me it doesn't matter what we're raised for if you don't know what America was raised for. Now, I
Are
know
you following that?
I am, because I was listening to the class. He's a Spanish student, so he's
Okay.
using different, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
So what he's saying is, what's it going to do for you in Adventism if you don't even know what the United States was raised for? What does it mean to you? How can you know what you're raised for in Adventists if you don't even know what the United States is raised for? So let's see here. So you're not going to be able to fight against the Sunday law if you don't know what is the path they're going through. So you have to know.
So you have to know. So in order for us to know our purpose, we have to know. Oh, okay, that's it. Okay.
So the problem with following the internal and not correctly following the external thread is that we reach a point of contradiction where what we believe internally contradicts how we want to see external events. We're going to say that point of contradiction is 2014 and forward, because we can get to Sunday law and say, okay, that's the Sunday law. We know that internally, but that looks good to me. I like that Sunday law. Just like we might like "In God We Trust" on our currency. We might get to November 9 and see Donald Trump place restrictions on the media and say, yeah, we prophesied that. But all this media is corrupt, and it speaks for the dragon power. It should have some restrictions. So we're justifying.
And can I say, sorry, and and thinking about "In God We Trust," is that on every coin? Mm-hmm. "In God We Trust" is on every coin?
And the money, that paper now.
Okay, yeah. And so that never went across my mind that "In God We Trust" is on this coin, unless it's brought to your attention that this is on the coin. I mean, when you have money and you have coins, all you're thinking about is what I'm going to do with this money, or, that I actually have it. And so it's just really interesting that
it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. Because it can easily surpass your mind, because you're not even thinking about, you're just thinking about, oh, I have some money. But who thinks about "In God We Trust" being on the coin unless you're...
Well, apparently a lot of people do, because they fight to have it there.
Yeah. So
I always thought it meant that the God of this world, to people who loved mammon, right, or money or material things. I always thought "In God We Trust" was Satan, to basically, because
that came out of the conspiracy theories and had us.
Did it?
Had us programmed to believe that we were worshiping the Satan, the God of this world. But here you're looking at the history of why they put it there.
Yeah.
They wanted to make this a Christian nation, and they said it needed to be recognized on the money.
I think I had a thought.
Yeah,
when
but that's still satanic when you think about it, because that's not what God would want.
Right.
Well,
He
that
would
is-
never want a forced worship. So
Right.
that's still satanic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adriana.
I think I had a thought when I was younger and I was pro, Adventism and against Sunday law, and I was wondering, like, how are we going to give a good argument for no Sunday worship when we have God everywhere? Like, because you can't make that argument, because I'm like, we need this here, but we also need to say that we can't worship on Sundays, which is a really, amalgamated thought, but like, how do you tell them we can't have church and state combination? No, the Sabbath.
So you can't tell them keep Sabbath either. Just like A.T. Jones,
I
Jones
know,
said.
but as a hypocritical Adventist, to not see that is that, okay, well, it's in the schools, it's in prayer, it's in the Pledge of Allegiance, it's on the money, and now you're going to tell them, but just on this one point, just don't make Sunday the Sabbath. That's not, we can't do that. This is fine, just not that. Like, you're hip.
We were supposed to be fighting against this
I
all
saw
along, like
that.
A.T. Jones did.
Yeah.
So let's see. So we might get to November 9 and see Donald Trump place restrictions on the media, and we say, yeah, we prophesied that, but all this media is corrupt and it speaks for the dragon power, so it should have some restrictions on it. So in other words, it's okay to restrict we would just be saying it's okay to restrict them. We can observe it internally, and we can fail it based on the external. It's not enough to know it's Sunday law if you still want it. This is why it becomes a subject now where we need to go back and observe the external thread and trace it. So just to recap on the Civil War one more time, in 1865, we marked the death of Abraham Lincoln. He's assassinated. Then 2019, symbolically, we mark the death of one type of government, the death of a dictator, and the rising up of a different dictator. And it's going to be the same person, but less restrained. We'll see and understand more when we start placing the revolutions, but we need to look at the people with a degree of caution. Abraham Lincoln in 1865 is Donald Trump in 2019, but he's not Donald Trump in 2001. We have to have good logic for how we identify those people.
That's so interesting. And then I wonder what she's gonna go into as far as the revolutions.
The revolutions, you
Yeah.
start getting into to November 9 more, I know that.
Cause you have a lot of revolution.
Yeah.
You know that, like,
And they all
Wow.
layer over. I'm looking forward to getting into that part of it.
yeah. Cause you have the American Revolution and then on and on. It's like, wow, interesting.
So in 1782, we have a completely secular motto in the United States. There's a secular Pledge of Allegiance, and it starts off with a separate church and state. We come to the history of the Civil War, and we're not discussing the Protestant horn, just the Republican horn. When we see this time period of national crisis, their first thought is that it's punishment by God for not recognizing him on the level of government. We see over this time period of the war that they decide in the phrase, "In God we trust," that will be the phrase placed on their coins, and we can mark these 3 dates as the development of that process that take us to 9/11, 2014, and 2019.
That was 1782 that was completed.
No, that's back up here for where they had the original model, E pluribus unum. But here, when you're looking at the 3 dates that are marked, these 3 dates here, 2001, 2014, 2019, are marked by 1861, 1863, and 1865.
Okay.
And then you can also see it coming back in the 50s as well. We also went into the history of the 50s, and there's really good articles and great sources of information on the religious revival of the 50s. But it had a political edge. Part of it was driven by business interests as a counter against socialism. We see how these same phrases, particularly "In God we trust," are resurrected in the 1950s until in 1956, it becomes the official motto of the United States. And also by law, it must be placed on every piece of currency, paper or coin. That is something that was developing in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Then we come to our history. 1861 takes us to 9/11. And again, this debate begins over "In God we trust," particularly relating to schools. It was shared at the camp meeting how A.T. Jones fought to keep the Bible teaching out of public government schools. Some people are making that same argument in 2001, but their excuse is that it's already on the currency. That has progressively happened state by state till we come to Arkansas 2017. I thought it was interesting that she doesn't note it, but I mean, that's where FFA is too. I thought it was interesting. They pass Act 911 and force this phrase into their schools. 1865 is the completion of this process of introducing this phrase. 1956 is the completion of this process for a second time on currency and also as the official motto. In different ways, both dates take you to 2019. There's been a revolution or civil war in the United States since 9/11. In this time period of crisis, there's been a steady push to bring the United States back to God, to start recognizing morality, to fight against threats and creeping socialism. All those excuses, real and imagined, are what's driving us towards the Sunday Law, the preparation of which already began in 2001.
Can I say something? Sister Debbie says, I was just reading up a bit on the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Interesting. I remember in the 1970s and 1980s there being discussion in current events and in SDA conservative circles as to whether the U.S. Constitution would, as to whether the U.S. would have another constitutional convention due to things occurring at the time. People recognize that if such a thing happened, it would endanger the current U.S. Constitution because anything could be opened up to be rewritten. This was a time period when Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority were pushing for affirming a Christian nation into the actual Constitution. Interesting. I think she added, it came to the place where a constitutional convention was not needed. Sister Debbie, did you want to expand on that? Or say something to that?
Sure. Thanks, Christine. And that's it. The last remark was simply because as time went on, past the late 1970s and into the 1980s, it came to be realized probably by some of the pushers and shakers, even after the moral majority was ended, but the leadership within Protestantism and so on, they wouldn't need to go the route of a constitutional convention. There was going to be another way, and a constitutional convention would be unneeded. And that's it. We're living in that day. You know, they don't have to open up the Constitution to rechange it. It's being changed already, you know, imperceptibly.
Interesting.
And with the revolutions, if I remember right, because I'm not real up to date on the revolutions, but I did go through all the classes, you know, we all probably have, but it's one piece of this that I still don't have in my own mind connected. But if I remember right, the revolutions are what allow us to show that the Civil War began at 9/11 in 2001, I believe. I think that's one point. And maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to, just based on what I remember, that's what I'm thinking.
I can't remember.
And I know that it takes you to November 9 in several places too, the overturning of a government and the setting up of a new government. But I think that's what helps place it at 9/11, as opposed to like Donald Trump and others are now saying that if you do this, it's going to be civil war. Well, we've been in civil war. So
Yeah.
we're looking at overturning. So,
and Sister Elaine, just picking up on that, and with the remark about the Constitutional Convention, that would make sense because the Constitutional Convention began just wanting to revise the Articles of Confederation in the U.S., the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. And the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was simply to look at tweaking the Articles of Confederation, but into the dialogue they came to understand they had to do they needed to do a complete new government.
Yeah.
And Madison was one of the ones leading out in that. And so it's very interesting. In 2019, in November, in a sense, we're going to have a brand new government, because it's going to be the same person, as you said, Donald Trump, but he's going to have far more power. And that's why they didn't ever have to have another constitutional convention. It was going to come about over time to bring it to the place where all the ends that the Protestants were pushing for, Christian nation, God back in the schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, were going to come about without a constitutional convention. And you could call it a dictatorship is put in place, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
His base, the more radical he gets, the more his base supports him.
And who's his base? From what I learned from Sister Adriana and putting that clip, that video clip is Fox and Friends. That's his base. Fox and Friends.
Oh, you watched that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I watched all of them, like most of them, the video ones. Skip the articles, but yes. That was interesting. Especially the part when they said if you're watching the test, if he was watching the show, they said flick your lights on and off, and he flicked his lights on and off. Yeah, and it was shown. So every time that he seeks he doesn't even just seek advice. He just likes the show.
They are his.
No, but yes, he does, but it's a specific show.
Yeah.
It's not just Fox. It's a specific show that he watched. No, it's Fox and Friends.
Fox and Friends.
That comes on about 9 and 10. Yes.
And he's very close with Hannity.
3 hours long, 7 days a week.
Yeah, and they realized that he watches shows, because through his tweeting, he would like comment on everything that they would say. They were like, "Oh, he listens to us." That gave them the platform to just start changing their whole language, to talking to some random audience, to talking to exactly. And ever since then, he has been, it's so crazy, because if you would originally hear what they would be talking about on that show, as far as the crazy conspiracies out there, and that guy, whoever did that video, is super good in describing that whole thing, because when I watched it, I was like, what are they even talking about?
Send me that one again, because I might have missed that one.
It's on
It's
the
just
website
on the
too.
devotional one from Friday. The first media link is Fox and Friends.
What are you even talking about? It doesn't even make sense. And he's getting sense from it. So then they're like, oh wow, Donald Trump listens to us. And so it's just crazy how they're putting these ideas to Trump, and he's listening to it. So now we know where he's getting his opinions from, his thoughts from. It's from them.
Because they're there was another video, I don't know if I put it on that website, but an interesting dynamic happened at Fox, because the guy who owns Fox actually doesn't like Trump very much, and they didn't get along very well.
But he's no longer in charge of Fox
No,
anymore.
that's the old guy. The new guy who has it.
Okay.
He didn't get along with Trump right off the bat. And it was shown that when he did that, and when Megyn Kelly was on there, and she was against Trump, and she was not ridiculed, scrutinizing him over some things he was doing, their ratings dropped. So he's like, even though we don't like Trump, our audience wants everything to be pro-Trump 100%. So you guys have to push Trump like you've never pushed Trump before. It was a money decision. It wasn't because he personally doesn't like Trump. And so for him to get viewers, he now has to pretend he's buddies with Trump. He has to go golfing with him everywhere. So he has to look like they're good together. And ever since Megyn Kelly left, and everything they do is 100% pro-Trump, now their audience is back and spiked like crazy. So what happens is the audience tells Fox and Friends what to believe and what to say, and they tell the president what to say.
Wow.
So Protestants run Fox and Friends, which runs the president.
Wow, that is so interesting.
And Sean Hannity is a big player with Trump.
Yeah.
But they just bumped heads recently, right? Fox is, who is it? Neil Cavuto came out with that big thing against Trump there not too long ago. And now Trump's talking about a state-run news agency that is no fake news. So he's talking about starting up his own news agency, which is exactly what Putin has with Russia television.
Oh wow, that
Trump
is
World
true.
News.
So I don't think that Fox and Trump are getting along so much now, because I don't know if you watched that big rant that Neil Cavuto had about him.
That's the same thing that happened in the election time, though. So if what's his face wants to keep having ratings, he's gonna get rid of Neil Cavuto, whoever he is. I haven't seen this, but I'm gonna be interested to see what happens. I'm gonna look into that.
Yeah,
It's either that, or he does get his own news station, which also matches what Hitler did, and it matches what Lenin did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's that with him touting that idea now, and he said we're going to look into it. There's the news article, I think it was Politico.
I don't know if this is conspiracy or not, but I heard that that was set up to improve ratings, that it wasn't really a rant against them, against the president, but he set that up for them to, I don't know, just to get more ratings for people.
But how would Trump go along with that? Trump obviously wouldn't have liked that. He doesn't care about the ratings. He cares that he has a propaganda machine.
Yeah, I know, but he was in on it too. According to I don't know if it was conspiracy or not, but what I heard was that Trump was in on it. Where did you hear it though? Do you have a place where we can go read that? Cisco, do you know where that came from? I'll have to find out. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we do need to keep in mind that Fox is the symbol for the wrong stream of information. It was raised up in 1996 very purposefully. So regardless of the individual players right now, today, it was to be the mouthpiece of the Protestant Christian religious right.
Yeah. Francisco said it was from CNBC. A journalist on there did a report on it, and that he found out that they were all in it together.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and pray and break for lunch.
I just want to real quick. So in the prayer, it's a prayer and a praise. So Victoria, you could write this down. Elder Byant, I guess it was last Sabbath or something. He baptized.
Hold on, Sister Tony, because I have to get up something where I write it. Okay.
There's 2 elder Byants. Which one are you talking about?
Yeah, man.
The one on WhatsApp. I guess the one that he teaches up there in Africa.
Manjit, that's a permanent.
Yeah.
Permanent brother.
Yeah. So he baptized 42 souls.
Wow.
That's not strange though for Africa. No matter what, like it's quite common there that people will get baptized sometimes a few times in a year. They always have massive baptisms. Like the Adventist Church went there and they baptized, was it 100,000?
Yeah, it's awesome.
Once, and it's like, and then these people, if there's no follow up, the next good thing that comes through, they get baptized with them too.
Yeah.
It's not to criticize it. I hope that this is more of an educated faith. It seems that people are understanding what they believe. I hope those numbers stick around, but retention is often.
So that was a praise report, Sister Tony.
It's a praise, but it's also a prayer, because as John is stating, people fall away and they're not reconnected after baptism, so they just go, they're not being like the pastors aren't keeping up on them, see how they're doing, if they need any help.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I was going to ask if Brother Victor would be willing to close in prayer and pray for the blessing over the food.
You know what? He had to go and escort someone home from church. So
Okay. Do you want to pray?
Sure.
Okay.
Heavenly Father, Lord, we come to you to thank you and praise your name for this blessed Sabbath day and the light that you continue to unfold. We ask that you would please keep each and every one of us on track with your truth. Lead us, Lord, help us to not forget your past. Help us to continue to follow the light, Lord, and we ask that you continue to guide each and every one of us. Give us the eyes out to see things clearly. We thank you, Lord, for the many blessings that we are each so unworthy of. And we ask at this time, as we begin to break bread individually, that you would please bless the food that we each eat. And we thank you for your Sabbath day. We thank you especially for the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus Christ. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Sister Leanne. Okay, we're gonna break for lunch. We'll be back at 2:30.
Okay.